go. Okay, so welcome to our 8th and final class. This has gone kind of quickly, it seems. Well, I guess they all, actually for me, it seems like they always go kind of quickly. Okay, so finishing with the political theory stuff, and then we'll see what we can do with the review we have time for. So wanted to start with Lenin's ideas about imperialism. And actually, I mean, I guess it's worth pointing out, Lenin's actually, his contributions to political theory come in kind of two directions. So one of them is the stuff about leading a revolution, you know, and in that way, he's taking Marx's ideas and then figuring out how to operationalize them, I guess in military terms, maybe. But because Marx seems like he was, cat hair everywhere. He was really kind of on two minds about how he thought organized political action would move a history. So on the one hand, his theoretical work seems to have the very basic idea that history is not really willed by anyone. It's reactions people have to things, and so history sort of happens, and people participate in that. It is their values and desires are driving that, but it's not something that you know when or where it could happen, because the primary driver, he thinks, is going to be economic, and in particular, so that capitalism has to collapse for socialism to come along, the way feudalism had to collapse. So it's not, in his view, it's not so much the Americans wanting to reject a king or the French wanting to reject a king that's really the end of feudalism. It's the fact of these economic forces that are coming along and driving out the rising capitalist forces, then drive out feudal forces. And so it's not exactly planned by anyone. So on that view, socialism is a matter of waiting. You might want to be organized about it, but you can't really make it happen. But on the other hand, he also spends a lot of time organizing, founding, and being part of groups that are advocating kind of revolutionary changes in society. They often use them in terms like working man's associations, but they're functionally like political parties in some levels. And so he clearly is spending a lot of important time in his life working on making changes in society. And there are places where he says that things like one of the most important first steps the working class could make, and he's writing this in his own context, would be to limit the workday. And so that was indeed, right, a big issue in that time period. It's in the late 1800s that we get legislation in this country about the 8-hour day. So, and that's driven by people protesting and organizing about that. So he sees an important role for people to organize themselves in order to make demands upon society. But the theoretical side is telling us that's not actually about the revolution. That's just about kind of making people's lives better in the meantime, so that they can eventually do something like make a revolution. So yeah, so it's hard to tell. Marx is not giving a coherent idea about how he thinks that's supposed to work. Lenin comes along and says, well, you know what? Let's just get organized about this. And so he has his ideas about a revolutionary political party, this idea that he calls that the party needs to operate on this concept he calls democratic centralism, which is the idea that the party as an organization should be a conversation among equals that makes decisions democratically. But once decisions are made, there is a structure and a hierarchy that's going to act on those decisions, and everybody's expected to cooperate with them. So democratic, but once the decision's made, it's central. And of course, he's leading a revolution, so this is a very common idea in how militaries operate, right? They're very centralized. You You don't question the structure that's what's going on. So so he's saying, well, we can get organized, we can do this, we can have this kind of approach to it. He also introduces a nuance to Marx's theory of ideology. So one of the important contributions Marx and Engels had was a book they wrote in about, I think it was 1870. It was called The German Ideology. And it's often seen as kind of the first book in sociology, that this was the book that invented the discipline of sociology. So they're studying German society, and what they're particularly interested in is, like, well, how is it that workers can look at their situation and yet somehow not decide that they want to rebel against that situation? And the answer that they come up with is this term ideology, which Marx and Engels use as a kind of false consciousness. So their thinking is, well, the ruling class dominates the world of ideas, dominates culture, dominates media. And so those ideas about that way of living, you think about how often do you see, ordinary people in movie and TV shows? They're very much about very rich people. You don't see a lot of ordinary life. So that's because the rich people control the means of disseminating this culture. So their thinking is, well, workers adopt this false consciousness of thinking like the capitalists, and so as a result then don't think about what would really be in their interests and how they could make life better for themselves. They just think like how the capitalists want to make life better for themselves. So it's a false consciousness. Lenin comes along and takes this idea and says, well, okay, but if we're trying to actually get organized and make change, then we need to make use of this idea, this ideology concept, but it has to be a little different. So for Lenin, ideology is a class consciousness. And so he thinks, well, there is a capitalist ideology, which is to say there is a way that the capitalists think about the world. But there's also for him a working class ideology or a revolutionary ideology, which is how workers properly understand the world, sort of at least from a very worker-centric point of view. And so the actual organizing of a party happens a lot in a world of ideas. So you need this working class ideology as a way of teaching people about the ideas of the party and that are part of making this revolutionary change. So ideology becomes sort of two things. It could be either it's a false consciousness if you're going to be very, very pure Marx about it, or it's a consciousness of a position which could be false or could be true, depending on what you're trying to say, which analysis you're offering with Lenin. So he's building up these ideas about how this kind of change can be made. Okay, so that's all one side of his contribution. The other side is this more theoretical economic analysis that comes from his book Imperialism, in which he's making an early argument, which becomes more and more popular with radical economists into the 20th century, about the difference between how colonialism works as a political economic system and how imperialism works as a political economic system, which happens around the turn of the 20th century. So Lenin is sort of well positioned to be seeing this change happen, and then in the books he's writing about it to describe that change. But the important point that he's wanting us to see is that something really significant in the world changes between colonial systems and imperial systems. And because colonial systems work on resource extraction, right? So you think about the British relationship with India. The British make money because India grows cotton and at one point indigo. And then the British would take the cotton and the indigo to mills in England, where more skilled labor I mean, it's not especially skilled compared to an engineer, but relatively skilled compared to peasants growing cotton. Laborers in England in the factories, they turn the cotton and the indigo into things like clothes and blue jeans, especially with the indigo. So, and then they sell the finished cotton products back to India. So the colonial system makes money because it's taken these resources from one place, finished them, and then is selling them back at a sort of much more expensive rate than the local population would pay for the same goods if they just finished them themselves. So colonialism is all about controlling resource extraction. Imperialism has changed this dynamic in that the fundamental issue after the 20th century is not the extraction of resources, but the movement of capital out of and into and around the world. And so finance capital can go in, and now instead of India being a place where the British are taking resources out, it now becomes a place where low-wage workers work. And so then now those capital, and that requires a lot of capital, right? Because you're building a factory and you're paying workers, and so that's a lot more capital intensive than a farm. So when the capital goes in to now extract labor, not just raw materials, but labor, then you have this dynamic in which the most important thing is not ships moving cargo, but banks moving money. And so for him, what he wants to notice is that, okay, that this is something that Marx didn't quite see coming. I mean, there are some little hints of it actually at the end of Marx's life where he starts to see some of these patterns, but it's not in the world really. But when Marx dies, it's only just being born. So, but by the time Lenin's writing, he's seeing all of this very clearly, that as Marx dies, the world has changed, and something very important about how capital works has changed. And along the way, what Lenin is analyzing is that this enables the capitalists in some sense to get the system sort of stuck, because now workers in the imperial center can be bought off because they're in a privileged position relative to workers in the rest of the world. In Marx's time, workers all over the world had a relatively equal immiserated status. But as you move forward in time, the workers, like in Europe and the United States, right, workers start to get a higher and higher standard of living, and so those workers are not thinking about themselves so much as exploited, as now they're recognizing that they're living well. So they're not interested in participating in these these systems of revolutionary change. So workers are bought off, and so that imperial dynamic has changed a lot of the patterns that Marx was seeing coming out of the world that he was living in. And so this is Lenin's argument then, that we can't wait for capitalism to simply collapse because it's found these other ways of operating. And in particular, that imperial system allows the pain of economic crises, because remember, capitalism has these patterns of crisis that it keeps going through. Every 4 to 7 years, there's a small downturn that we call a recession. And every 7 decades, there's a major downturn that we call a depression. And that's a pattern that's been clearly at play since the 1800s, and especially the economic depression of the 1870s. Right? 1870s, there's a depression. 1930s, there's a depression. And now we seem to be in the conditions of a new depression. So every 7 decades or so. And then in between, there's these small cycles. So capitalism keeps having these crises. And Marx saw this as sort of like it was circling around the drain going down the toilet. It's just how many times around the circle can this go before the bottom falls out? And that's the collapse then that would be the end of capitalism. But now that capitalism has adopted this imperialist phase, the consequences of those recessions and depressions can actually be offloaded onto the colonial countries so that they suffer more of the consequences of those economic difficulties, shielding the imperial center and the working class in the imperial center from it, thus not driving the workers in the imperial center to revolution. Now, there's still the open question, how long can this actually go on? I mean, we are in a sense still circling the drain, and you know, if capitalism survives this depression cycle, can it actually survive another one in another 60, 70 years? What would that look like? Or will workers decide one of those recession cycles they've had enough? So there's still this possibility workers will decide they've had enough of this, but there's this buffer that's built in with this imperial system. Anyway, so Lenin then has this innovation that the classical Marxists will call stage skipping, because he's just saying, okay, we're going to take Russia, we don't care where it is, we're just going to get organized about it, and we're going to just impose a revolutionary form on it. And okay, problem, and what we discover though is that there are negative consequences that come with this kind of thinking too, that the Chinese are also now playing with, which is that development, the process of enough capital accumulating that you move to a high developed, high capital, high income manufacturing kind of country, that process is actually a fairly brutal process, and people pay for it with their labor and their lives. And we know about how the English working class did from how Dickens described it. We have, you know, some experience with that with ourselves, and a lot of it happens with slaves, are the ones bearing the brunt of that, but also with the industrial working class in the early 20th century and late 19th century here in the North. But in Russia, they make this revolution, and then they discover, well, they have to build up their industry, especially because there's these nut jobs in Germany. And so somebody pays the price. And then you have to have Stalin and the hard fist of Stalin to force the industrialization. So the Soviet Union can industrialize, but it comes at a price. China is industrializing, but it comes at a price, right? You have these workers who work in these horrible conditions, and they make the fancy devices that we use, but their lives are fairly miserable. But there is this end result that China is developing, and the Chinese Economic Ministry has this plan that within the next 10 years they're going to move from being a low-wage manufacturing country to a high-wage manufacturing country, which is part of the conflict that the Chinese and the US are having right now, is about, well, who's going to be the center of the world economy in this way, and that China is inevitably going to take over unless the US sort of freaks out and decides to start a war with it. So, but anyway, this is a real issue for the US working class right now. So anyway, but it's what seems like what's going on is that the Chinese are coming out of that, the way the Soviets at one point came out of that, but the military spending that they had to do to keep up with NATO and the US prevented them from developing a consumer economy, where the Chinese are recognizing that mistake, and they're developing a consumer economy alongside the development of the rest of the economy. So they're learning, the Chinese seem to be learning some important lessons from the failures that the Soviet Union went through. But okay, primary takeaway here with Lenin then is Lenin is about forcing history, where Marx is more about waiting for history. Okay, that was kind of quick and kind of a lot of material. How are you doing? Okay, because remember, so point of this class is big ideas. What are the big ideas? Okay, so that's the revolutionary perspective. The other people that I have to talk about today are more well, they sort of represent where a lot of where political theory has gone in the latter half of the 20th century. So John Rawls and John Nozick are really the two biggest names in American political theory, especially the last half of the 20th century, but maybe arguably for the whole of the 20th century. They both taught it at Harvard, and they had offices down the hall from each other, and they spent their entire lives arguing with each other. And it seems it's sort of poetic in a way, because even though Nozick was younger, when Rawls died, Nozick died shortly after that, as if he didn't have anyone to argue with, and so there wasn't a point in going on. It's just his health wasn't as good as Rawls, which is why he died earlier. But it just sort of looks this way. It's like these two guys spent 50 years arguing with each other, and then one dies and the other just dies too. So Rawls is very much a kind of liberal, reformist, capitalist kind of thinker. Nozick is a very radical libertarian, but libertarian has gone through, that word has gone through some changes since Nozick was really doing his important work. And so one thing keep in mind is there are people that we call left-wing libertarians and right-wing libertarians. And the left-wing libertarians generally want to emphasize liberal thinking very universally. So they're social liberals as well as economic liberals. Remember, economic liberal means the state doesn't plan. It's all up to the economy, all up to the market. So so we have, in the US, there is a party called the Libertarian Party, which historically has advocated these points of views. But over time, a lot of the attention or money in libertarian politics has moved very much to the right, and that's sort of where the Republican Party is. That it wants economic liberalism, and then it wants free markets, but it actually doesn't care anymore about those social liberal ideas, and so it's adopting the sort of right-wing totalitarian politics around social control rather than the liberal, open-minded policies that a libertarian would normally have. And as a result, that leads them to be more militaristic and all of the things you would associate with the word right-wing. So this libertarian thing, right, it is very much of these two minds. Nozick is wanting to defend the left-wing libertarian view, in that he wants social liberalism as well as economic liberalism in a vibrant sort of democratic society around that. You end up with the same critique about wealth concentration with every libertarian thinking about, well, what is it? Why is it you think that wealth being concentrated more and more and more somehow isn't going to ultimately destroy society? So they all have a hard time answering those kinds of questions. But they're, at least with Nozick, he's not defending totalitarianism the way that someone like Rand Paul seems to in these days. That he likes to pretend he's a libertarian, but push comes to shove, and he's happy supporting a police state and any kind of draconian conditions you want, as long as the market, as long as there aren't any rules on what capitalists do. Okay, but John Rawls. So let's do Rawls first. So Rawls, both of these guys wrote a number of books. They each had one book which was sort of defining for them, and that's the one we'll talk about with each of them. The ideas that come out of that one main book. So again, Rawls writes a lot. Rawls is basically adopting a kind of Kantian ethic. So he wants to think about things in terms of principles, but he's not an idealist the way that Kant was. So he doesn't have the same kind of grounding that Kant has for his ethics. Because for Kant, it's all about the nature of consciousness and consciousness recognizing itself, and so for Kant it slips into this sort of metaphysical question about what's the nature of consciousness. Rawls isn't going to follow Kant down that path, but he still thinks, okay, this stuff about using principles is going to be the best way to do ethics. So he's still in that. So that's the fancy word for that is deontological. So he's applying that kind of Kantian ethic, but thinking about modern democratic politics. And the idea that he comes up with that really takes off is this kind of thought experiment that he calls a veil of ignorance, which comes out of a more complicated set of ideas he calls the original position. And the veil of ignorance is just sort of the most important detail of that original position. But the basic idea is that the ideal way to organize a society, if you could do this, and he's not saying this is a practical idea, it's a theoretical idea to use as a tool to think about things. But if you could do it, the idea would be you would take a bunch of the citizens of the society, and you would have them construct a constitution on the grounds that they couldn't know anything about their own position in society while writing that constitution. So the idea being, well, right, someone like Madison, when he writes our Constitution, he does it very much from the perspective, I'm the richest person in the country, that has to stay this way. So whatever we do, we have to preserve the fact that I'm the richest person in the country. So what Rawls is saying is, that's where things go off the rails. What you need is you need to make a constitution in which you don't know. You have no idea where you would be dropped into the society. What rules would you accept in those conditions? So, so of course you know who you are and what you're like, but he wants you to imagine I don't know anything about my own position. What rules would I think are acceptable as a constitutional framework? And he's not suggesting the rules to us. He's not suggesting what this constitutional framework would be or look like, but he's saying this is the way to get there, is you use this veil of ignorance. I am ignorant of my own position in society, and that's how I'm going to go about doing this. And what he's done in constructing it that way, in a sense, is he's found this little trick of a thought experiment to try and get us to be much more kind of honest Kantians, in a sense, because fundamentally Kant's most basic teaching is still what we call the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's still fundamentally the most basic conclusion that Kant's defending. So what Rawls has done is, you just said, if you're going to be serious about that kind of idea, you can't pretend that defending wealth is the right thing to do because you're wealthy. You need to ask this question more neutrally. What would a neutral observer actually think about this? Not what do I in my privileged position think about that? Because from there, you're not getting out an honest Kantian answer because you're too interested in your own position. But once you're neutral on your own position, ignorant in this language, then you're cognitively in a space where you can actually be honest about answering those questions. What would be acceptable to someone who didn't know? And what Rawls, is sort of assuming along the way is that ordinary people tasked with this kind of experiment would ultimately construct a society that looks a hell of a lot like Denmark. Which is why we keep using Denmark as an example of the pinnacle of social achievement in the world. They seem to produce a happy society. They live very well. They don't get into a lot of trouble. Their standard of living is among the highest in the whole world per capita. So that's, it's the kind of rules that they have in their society that are producing that. So it's a lot of taxes on wealth, and then a lot of free services that the government's providing to people: education, health, pensions, a lot of innovative transportation schemes and stuff like that to make life easier.
Richard, might he achieve the same, close to the same goal if everyone were allowed to participate? I shouldn't say everyone, just representing different interests and be forced to negotiate.
That's kind of the practical version of it. So they're rewriting, they just came up with a new draft for the Constitution in Chile. And this is what they did. They wanted to take a cross-section of people from the population, and they had them participate in a big conversation about, so that's exactly it. The way to do that in practice is you just have to use a whole bunch of people instead of one person trying to be neutral.
Or one group of people.
But from lots of different social strata, and men and women and tribal people and non-tribal people and rich people and poor people, and
now, go ahead.
From the first, I've not heard a real detailed analysis yet of this first draft of this Constitution, but the little bit I've heard about it seems that people are the liberal political establishment, the professors who talk about this are all very pleased at what the Chileans are up to.
Because really, we have been living under rules of wealthy white people.
Right. So if you change the rules, society actually looks different. And and I think that's really, people don't often appreciate sort of how much that's true. The way there's a lot of how the world works that's actually been organized in a way that happened maybe decades ago, and we don't really quite appreciate that we're living in that. Like the redlining that happened with the allowing Black people to vote where they could buy houses or not buy houses and all of that stuff. So it's sometimes pretty shocking to discover that's the world is this weird dysfunctional way. And it's because we adopted these strange rules some time back, and no one's been questioning those rules and why they're doing what they do.
I was a mail carrier at the height of the redlining in Chicago when I was going through college, and I delivered mail in a neighborhood that was ultra conservative. And I saw flyers that said, if you see a Black person driving a car or parking a car, take their tires out, and all, promoting all kinds of vandalism to scare them from the neighborhood.
Wow. Yeah, wow. Icky.
It turned my stomach even back then to see that.
Well, we've made some progress. Some. What are you gonna do? People are a problem. I keep coming back to that.
Yeah.
All right. So Nozick, Nozick then is going to come along and defend a lack of rules is sort of the idea that and his primary thinking is relying a lot on John Locke. So Locke's thinking about property and freedom and how all of that works, and all of that. Locke's thinking is really significant because he's coming up with a theoretical framework that's really going to undergird capitalism as it fights with feudalism in order to come out from the shadow of feudalism. And so ideas, like freedom, the word freedom in that context is different from than what Rawls might mean from freedom, but is very much what Nozick means by freedom, is he's still referring back to these Lockean ideas that are primarily to do with what is the freedom of my property? What are the rules on my property? And his argument is that a state that controls property is a state that is controlling people's behavior, because people are the ones trying to determine what they want to do with their property. And so this telling people what they can and can't do with their property is an onerous burden on the face of it. And so his libertarian philosophy is that then we should just minimize all of those burdens on society and let people's individual freedom express itself the most. And This also is a heavily Kantian argument, which is interesting on the face of it, is that they're both going to use the same theoretical framework, and they both have, and they both are reaching deep into it in some ways in order to construct the theory, because it's the idea that, like, for example, the solution to bad speech is more speech. This is sort of a very old liberal way of thinking, goes back actually to probably to Mill, if not before him, but is very much part of this kind of thinking, that, and it comes out of a lot of Kantian thinking, because you don't, we as sort of a matter of natural human liberty, we want to be able to express ourselves. And so this idea that you in order to navigate problems that come with that, you'd rather not rely on coercive mechanisms to solve problems. You want some other mechanism. So you can rely then on more speech, not restraining it. Now, and I think, well, what's interesting, I think, about that kind of argument is that the internet seems to have taught us that it doesn't work. That you can have an infinite amount of speech, and somehow the bad speech is able to monopolize attention and able to be more powerful. So I think it's interesting. Prior to the internet, Nozick, especially the going attack, confronting this argument, especially using free speech examples, was much easier to do. But today, I'm not even sure how I would sell it. Could just sell it to anyone who's paid any attention to how the internet works. It's just like, it's a great idea on the face of it, and then when you see it in practice, like, something's really broken down here with this concept. But it's a hard problem. I mean, that's the other side of it, is that it's still a hard problem, because while it's bad speech can get out of control, how you go about putting it into control or trying to keep it in control, there are different schemes you could deploy with different costs, and it's not at all clear which one would be the most workable, or what would have the lowest cost, because there are always bad things that come with restricting people's liberties. But sometimes that's important, and the classic example, right, is you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. So, so we do recognize that there are limits to free speech, but the limiting cases can sometimes be sort of easy because they're really extreme, like the fire in the crowded theater. And it's the more ordinary cases that we run into that are presenting problems. But anyway, Nozick is certainly of the view that this example applies to all sorts of aspects of life, that the having restrictions on what people are doing is onerous on them, and therefore should be avoided at all costs.
Richard, is this uniquely American? Because I was surprised to learn in Germany there are heavy restrictions on speech and activity, especially around Nazism.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have a problem with it. They don't consider it onerous, or their freedoms have been taken away.
Yeah, now there is, it's kind of Anglo-American, I think.
Okay.
And yeah, it is sort of interesting in the, especially in the 1800s, a lot of European intellect, a lot of continental intellectuals look down on the English as being money grubbing. That they're all in business. That's all they do. They're all in business. They don't seem to care about anything else. And so the idea, what we've done, what the Anglo-American thinking has done, is sort of combined speech and money, right? So we know that the way the Supreme Court has done that. But that's a deep Anglo-American thought that economic activity is somehow the primary part of my life. And so there's a lot of philosophies that have said, whoa, you people, you need a more well-rounded life. Your whole life is not about the economy. But that Anglo-American philosophy, it has very much been that way. And so it's English, it's an English language problem. And I think the Australians, like the New Zealanders, are a little more nuanced about it than the British or Americans are. Interestingly enough, especially with the Australians, because they're so much more flamboyant. But there are places and times where they seem to figure out, well, okay, we got to get together and get something done, and then they do. But yeah, England here, yeah, harder to do that kind of thing. Okay. Any questions about those things? Okay. All right. Well, Shania Drury then. She became a little well known when the second George Bush was being elected, and there's a core of thinkers around Cheney who called themselves neoconservative. And what Drury got to be real known for was her books about this neoconservative philosophical or political movement. And it starts with a philosopher named Leo Strauss. Now, Strauss was a political theorist in Germany. He was Jewish and had to flee the Nazis. As Drury puts it, he learned all the wrong lessons from this experience. So Strauss comes up with this analysis, which is very rooted in the ancients, and that's really what that's his area of expertise was kind of was Greek and Roman political theory. So he's very much a fan of Plato. Now, someone who's not educated, who's a fan of Plato, is a fan of Plato because he understands that Plato is an elitist. So Strauss is not an accidental Platonist. He understands what he's doing. He knows to the Plato he's defending. And Plato had this idea about how the ideal society would work that he lays out in the big book that's called The Republic. And what Plato comes up with is that that society has three sorts of people in it. There are the wise who understand the world and what's going on. There is a political class under them who are properly controlled when things are working right. They're properly controlled by the wise, but it's not important that they know what the hell's going on. They're just functionaries meant to get things done. So they often have no clue. This was the guardian class in Plato, I believe, because the philosopher class would be above that. And then, right, Plato, as I say, you have one of the philosophers should be a king. So then there is the rest of the society, the rabble. And what's important, right, is that the political class is there to control the rabble. And Plato comes up with at one point this idea that he calls a noble lie, that the guardian class, the gentlemen in Strauss's version, the gentlemen believe, which are sort of the core myths of society, there are the Greek or Roman version would be, well, there are these gods, and we have this relationship with these gods, and so we have to have these rituals, and we have this political structure because the gods have told us we need to have this sort of political structure, and that's why we have a king. And no, none of the wise believe any of this. This is they understand this is all just a farce that's being sold to control the masses. Just part of where Marx's critique of religion comes from. But for Plato, this is very, very important. This is how you do it when you're doing it right. So Strauss is picking that up, and this is the wrong lesson he learned from the Nazis. So there needs to be the wise governing things, and what you end up with then is someone like Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz, that they fancy themselves the wise, and they're going to control a political class under them, the gentlemen, who, when you look around Congress, right, you see a lot of people who look like buffoons, who don't really seem to know much of anything, but they get paid to do stuff. So the gentlemen do stuff, and they control the society, but they're largely a bunch of fools. But the important part is they will sell what Strauss will now call the pious fraud of religion. And so you need this pious fraud of religion to control people. And better yet, you need war. War is the perfect way to control people, because it gets them out of themselves and gets them to sacrifice their lives, their treasure, their children to the state. So you need a lie about how the world works, and then you need wars to keep them occupied. Now, when you think about George Bush, does it look like he did this? Well, of course, this is why we invaded Afghanistan, why we invaded Iraq. We have to have wars. Now, the other thing that is to notice here is that these people who call themselves neoconservatives, they're not just Republicans. There's a bunch of them that are Democrats too. And if you look at the war in the Ukraine, one of the things that might stand out to you is they never talk about negotiations. They never talk about ending the war. It's always winning the war. And they know you can't win the war soon, right? This has to be something that'll take a decade or more. So this is what they're selling, is we're going to have a war in the Ukraine for the next decade. And that's okay. They're just ignorant peasants, so they die. The wise understand you need war. You have to have war. You have to have lies to justify the wars and get people to sacrifice for the wars. So anyway, just want to point that out, because that's why they never talk about negotiations. It's because it's the same neoconservative ideology manifesting itself in the State Department and the Pentagon, now in the hands of a Democrat, but it's not that different from the hands of a Republican, because it's the same basic political philosophy that you control society by having an elite who lie to willing stooges who disseminate the lie to everyone else, and then everyone else just follows along. That's neoconservatism in a nutshell. So Drury is sort of, now when they write about it, they dress it up in pretty language. When Shadia Drury talks about it, she talks about it the way I just did. They don't like her. They don't like her at all. Which is predictable. But I think it's sort of, but anyway, it's important to know that this philosophy of governance is out there, and that it's a big part of how the world works. This is what they're doing. Yeah. Now the other part of there's a piece of this that's also kind of that's important to keep in mind, in that it's this idea has a lot of economic significance, which goes back to this thing that Eisenhower warned us about when he was leaving office, right? His speech about the military-industrial complex, is that because of the instabilities of capitalism, we have to have some mechanisms that are going to mediate it. And the basic ideas about how that should be done track to a guy named John Maynard Keynes, who was a British economist, very important at the turn of the century and into the 20s and 30s. It's his ideas that were made operational by Roosevelt in the New Deal. And in particular, what Keynes was saying is that the government needs to use powers either to create money or tax powers in order to get money and spend money in order to navigate these crises. And so Keynes sort of becomes the most important philosopher, the most important economic theorist in the 20th century, because it's his ideas that are governing how governments work almost everywhere. So regardless of the rhetoric of free markets, any serious government planner will admit that only goes so far. You have to have other mechanisms that are doing things. Now, what Keynes had in mind, and what the Roosevelt administration did a lot of, was you need these social programs that just put people to work and create stuff. So you can create infrastructure like park systems and roads and all of these building projects that were part of the Works Project administration. And then you can make it pretty with arts projects and all of that. But you spend a lot of money to keep people employed so that they can keep spending money, so that companies can keep making things and sell to people, and that keeps the economy going. But right, we've downgraded all of those in suppressing the New Deal politics, but the problem doesn't go away. What it's done is it's gone into military spending. And so the US and a lot of Western Europe, but especially the British, and some extent the French and Germans, are now relying on the fact that they have to spend money on arms as a way of pumping money into the economy. So the war doesn't just focus people's attention and serve this ideological purpose in Marx's original sense of false consciousness. It has this economic function of putting money into the economy. And so that's called military Keynesianism. And economically, it's working in, the mechanism is the same. You're putting money into the economy, it employs people, the people you employ spend money, that generates more and more economic activity, and you sort of build an upward spiral. The problem is the military spending has this outrageous profit rate that comes with it. And so too much relative to what you could do with other kinds of spending, too much of it ends up getting siphoned off into the rich in the form of profits, and only a smaller part of it goes into the hands of the workers who are going to spend it. And so when you pump money into the hands of the rich, in spite of all of this crap about lower taxes on rich people somehow helping the economy, when you allow rich people to have more money, they tend not to spend it. They tend to just hold on to it because they're already spending as much as they can. How when you're a billionaire, how do you spend more money? So they just end up amassing more and more and more. And so the military Keynesianism as an economic policy is it's a very weak hand. It helps some, but it doesn't help that much. But if it's all you got, if you refuse to use any other Keynesian mechanisms, and it's the only mechanism you're willing to use to put money into the economy, then it becomes very, very important. Thus, you've heard people in the last few weeks talking about, we need to double our military budget, which is, just sort of the most laughably absurd thing anyone could possibly say. But if you're committed to an ideology in which you refuse to spend any money on any kind of social program that does any kind of good for people, and the only way you'll spend money in society is on the military, well, then that becomes an important economic mechanism, as well as this ideological mechanism, whatever moral purposes you might think the war is serving. There's these other motives are part of the motivation for the war. So we are at war. And I think Drury, anyway, this really does explain why. Drury, I think, is a very important thinker in the world today. for laying out these kinds of details and sort of laying it bare that this is really what's going on. And she also, at the same time, is explaining why are Republicans so attached to these bizarre fascistic social policies. Well, it's because they need these lies to tell people about how the world works and get them worked up in various ways. Okay, any questions about that? That's kind of heavy stuff, but I thought it's important to know.
Well, it sort of explains the interconnection with religion that's so bizarre to me. You know, the evangelicals are promoting a lie.
Mm-hmm. Or pious fraud.
Or pious fraud, yes, I have to remember that term, pious fraud.
So that's Strauss. Plato's was noble lie.
Oh, okay.
Pious fraud is Strauss. All righty, how are we doing? You look tired as a group.
Yeah. It's been an awful week, hasn't it?
It has been an awful week. Yeah. Well, okay, so what we have, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm hoping that before you're done, you're going to go back to your thing from week 4. That I know it's like backtracking a little bit, but
well, that was the next question. What of what we've done would you like me to review? What did I put down for you? Okay, well, all righty. What the basic ideas that I'm pulling out here are primarily rooted in my dissertation. And what I did there was to start by taking Daniel Dennett sort of seriously. So remember, he's the guy with that narrative center of gravity idea. And what I was doing, well, okay, so I wanted to take that seriously, and I wanted to bring that into a conversation with some ideas in religious studies about the nature of religion. And so the organized study of religion as kind of a university style discipline really goes back to a guy named Mircea Eliade, who was born, I think, very end of the 1800s. So he ended up in the US also fleeing the Nazis. He was Czechoslovakian at the time, whatever it was called when he was born there. When I learned about him, it was called Czechoslovakia. So Eliade had this idea that human beings are essentially religious. And so he uses the Latin homo religiosus to express that idea. And he was himself a believer. So these things are connected for him. And he develops this idea he calls theophany, which is kind of an eruption of the sacred into profane, ordinary reality. So he thinks that, we look at older religions around the world, and they will have sacred objects, sometimes sacred places, a stone that's sacred, a tree that's sacred. And Eliade's idea is that, well, there was a point at which somebody had a profound experience in this place around that object. That experience was an eruption of kind of of divine reality, the sacred, into ordinary experience, or the profane. And so that experience having value to the individual is shared, and people come to then treat this place or thing as a sacred object or sacred place, a theophany. And so that becomes kind of one of the dominant theories about what's going on in religion, is that religion is about these emotional experiences that people have, and generally they're going to be experiences that people have a hard time explaining. And so since they're difficult to explain, you'll go to some alternative theoretical explanation for it. And then you end up with sacred or divine or God as the explanation. And that idea, because he's the guy who's sort of first writing about this stuff, that becomes very, very definitive of the field going forward. So when the professors who taught me were being educated in the 60s and 70s, this was the theory they were all being taught as the foundational theory. But along the way, there were some other there are other ideas that have come up along the way. One of them, actually a little older than Eliade, but it comes from a French guy named Emil Durkheim, who is along with Marx and Engels and Max Weber, thought of as as the founding fathers of sociology. And Durkheim was like a half generation older than Eliade, so his work all comes before Eliade. And Durkheim had this important book that he wrote, this huge tome called the Elementary Experience of Religion. Oh, Jesus. Something like that, Elementary Experience of Religion. Anyway, he spent a number of years in Australia hanging out with the Aborigines and trying to understand what it was they were up to. And so then he wrote this really long book, and the introduction and the conclusion contain this really interesting theoretical analysis that he's employing. And the conclusion that he came to was that there is this kind of religious sensibility that the Aborigines had that he sees as the same everywhere. And so he's comparing high Catholic religion in France to the religion of the Aborigines in Australia. And he's saying, okay, religion is all the same thing. It's just taken on these much more sophisticated forms because it's in France, and we've had all this technology and the development of various arts and architecture. And so we have cathedrals and all that, but it's actually the same thing. And then, so, well, okay, what is that thing? And what the thing is for Durkheim is it's social cohesion, is that there are, and here it's, keep in mind, the most basic definition we use for religion is a worldview with a ritual system. So it's a way of thinking about the world and understanding it with a ritual system that reinforces that worldview. If you have those two things, you have a religion. That's kind of the most basic definition. So anyway, Durkheim's point was, well, the most important stories in that worldview are really about how the society works, and the most important rituals are the rituals that are bringing people together and creating the social cohesion, because that's the most important thing about religion. That's what religion is all about. It's all about this social cohesion. Eliade comes along. No, it's all about these emotional experiences that are unusual and but compelling to us. And then, okay, along the way too, then there are other people, and the most compelling version comes along in the 1960s in a guy named Peter Berger, sociologist, a sociologist of knowledge, actually, in this case. But the idea Berger comes up with is that what religion's really doing with these stories and these rituals is it's defining people. It's telling them who they are and how they fit in society. And so he sees this very much in existential terms, about defining what the nature of existence is and defining the individual's place and all of that. So I'm coming along and working on what I'm doing, and I'm looking at these three guys, and it's like, well, it seems senseless to argue between them. Clearly, they're all saying something that's really, really important. So what I concluded was that religion is doing all three of these things. Religion provides social cohesion, provides existential definition, and it provides a context for experiences, unusual and emotional experiences. So all three of those things are important. So then the question becomes, well, why? Why would religion do that kind of a thing? And that's where I want to take it into psychology. And so start with this idea from Dennett. Well, we're constructing a self. Okay, so what goes into constructing this self? And I rely also on a number of other another important contemporary psychologists and neuroscientists. And what I end up arguing is that there are identifiable mechanisms in the brain that we can see how they relate to all three of these things, sort of more or less. The emotional ones are kind of fun to track with cognitive psychology. The social one is a lot more ordinary and plain, that the human beings need social things. But there's the same, you can go to psychological sources and look at how human beings are constructed, and some of this rely on like child and developmental psychology, looking at how people grow and brains develop. And so my book ended up arguing that we can understand what religion is by understanding more deeply what human beings are like, and then seeing that human beings need these three things. And so religion arises historically as the cultural construct. And another way of talking about religion that's come along through the years, religion is the depth dimension of culture. That goes to a guy named Clifford Geertz. So as depth dimension, so religion is the part that's sort of giving reality or grounding everything in the culture above it. So anyway, so that foundational element fits then into my thinking about what human beings are. And if you're trying to take this, what in essence is sort of a fragile consciousness that, and this goes to a lot of kind of psychoanalytic ideas, that we're thrust into a complicated world, especially a social world that has a lot of complex rules, and our little brains have to try and figure out what's going on all the time. And so we make up these patterns and stories, and well, actually, since we're pattern seeking creatures, we go out looking to find patterns in the world, and sometimes we identify false ones, and sometimes we identify real ones, and which is where psychoanalysis comes in to kind of undo the false ones. But that consciousness is fundamentally a fragile kind of construct, and that's why religion is there to provide these things to help the fragility of that consciousness ground itself and find roots. And so the addition that I had to Dennett's theory is actually in that narrative theory of that narrative web idea, not the center of gravity one, but the other one about a narrative web of self that I talked about, like the spider's web, except it's three-dimensional. So my addition to Dennett's thinking is that in that web, some of those strands get to be reinforced, and so they become really strong. And therefore, they're kind of grounding to the web as it moves through time. And that's precisely what religion is trying to do with rituals, is it's trying to construct through repetition the reinforcing of these strands of the narrative web, such that we could say someone is a Hindu or someone is a Muslim. But the reason that's true is because in my theory, they have a whole bunch of strands in their narrative web that are all woven out of either Islamic or Buddhist cultural and religious material. And that's what that's what brings someone into the tradition that way. Now, what comes a little harder to deal with for me, theoretically, is, well, what do you do with people who aren't religious? And my thinking is that, well, we're all still religious. We just in a secular society, we find ourselves more often having to cobble together bits and pieces of a worldview that we get from scattered sources instead of from organized sources, the way a religious tradition would do coherently through time. You would have a set of ideas it's trying to teach people. But in a secular culture, you can pick up ideas from a lot of different places like that. And so if you're not part of any kind of organized religion that's teaching you them, then you're having to construct it yourself. And what you end up doing is constructing a religion of one. And so we're all still, so I end up arguing we're all still religious. But again, my theory of religion doesn't have to involve a God. It involves these other things. But we can do it in a more or less organized way in the secular world, where one possibility is to construct a very idiosyncratic religion of one, although it may not be that idiosyncratic because you're a part of a culture that is making you similar to a lot of other people in your culture anyway. So, but in the final analysis, all of there are the individual details going into that worldview of yours that are just yours. And so you have things you do in your life that can take on for sort of ritualized aspects, and that they tend to reinforce your ways of thinking because you keep doing the same things that keep reinforcing the same thinking. So anyway, so that's what I argue, is that we're all still religious, even if it's a religion of one. What do you think of that?
What do you do with the notion of community?
That's the social bit, yeah. That we need to be social. So
your religion wouldn't necessarily.
Well, if you're in a secular world, yeah, you're gonna construct that social more haphazardly, which is also so when I'm writing about this kind of stuff, what I end up doing is arguing this is actually why organized religion is still a useful thing in society, is that if you're relying on a community that you're constructing just idiosyncratically, it may not survive that well. And as I've gotten older, what I've realized is the important question to ask people to think about in these terms is, who will bury you? And when I'm talking to younger people, I've discovered even like 30-year-olds, that's still a kind of defining generational question, that they don't quite get to a place where they really take the question seriously. But you get to be like past that in your 40s or 50s, and all of a sudden it's like, I see how that's a real question in the world. But I think that's the way I like to put it for people, is to sort of think about, well, there is a point in your life where this is going to be a question, and do you want to be part of a community that's going to answer that question for you, or are you just going to leave it to a few friends and relatives to sort of figure out for themselves what to do? Which is what a lot of people end up doing. But along the way too, the community has other benefits as well, that you are celebrating life events, and you celebrate joy, and you celebrate tragedy, or you honor tragedy and celebrate joy, and you get through life in the community as well. So I think it has the community aspect, I think, has lots of value in a lot of ways. But that question about, I think, burying you is just a good one for the people who don't, if they're really stubborn in pushing back on what's the value of community. That's my ultimate pushback.
What's the value of religion?
Well, what's in this case religious community? Yeah.
Okay. What did you write this all in a book?
Well, I wrote. Yeah, I did.
Good job.
This you can get this from online bookstores, wherever. So this was my dissertation, but put into a book form.
So Richard, go ahead. When you say who will bury you, my parents were from Greece, and therefore nominally Greek Orthodox. They were not real religious, and my dad wanted his body given to science. A priest refused to do a service under those conditions.
Really?
And my mom said, so what? I'll find a minister who will give a service.
Well, good for her.
So when you say, yeah, she was one that said it's between me and God and nobody else. But so when you say who will bury you, what does that really mean?
Well, I think what it really means is who's going to be around your grieving relations and friends to help them.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean that's how it cashes out, because you're dead, you don't care.
Right.
What these people are really doing is they're helping whoever you left behind. They're there to comfort
Okay,
other people.
that makes sense. Yeah, to comfort.
That's why this is that priest, that failure. It's just such an utter failure. I mean, it's like, what the hell, dude?
Well,
Get caught up in the
you remember some people were unbaptized because the priest used the wrong word. I don't know where that happened, but
It was in like New Mexico.
it's
Yeah.
it was invalidated.
It's
The
just
baptisms.
just such magic. It's such bizarre magical thinking about this. Is not a magical incantation. I don't. Yeah.
And not being religious or part of a religious organization, I can see the benefit of being part of one.
Hmm?
It's just not in me.
you and Groucho Marx.
I mean, intellectually, I can see it might feel good to be part of a group that thinks alike, but it, yeah.
Well, I can tell you from my synagogue, we don't, thinking alike is a stretch.
I was gonna say the same thing in the Catholic Church.
We do all agree we're Jewish.
As a Catholic, I do think that the idea of invalidating the baptism is nuts. I think God understands the intent. So let's go on, people.
So
I think Judaism is unique, though, in allowing discussions and points of views.
It's much more encouraging of that kind of, yeah. But liberal religion in general does that, where wherever you find liberal versions of it, it's all going to do that too.
That's true. That's true.
But I mean, it is. I mean, the synagogue does. I mean, there's a lot of shared values, right? It's a very pro. It was founded by a gay rabbi and with a number of gay people, so it's a very gay friendly space, and that's an enduring value in the synagogue, and very pro feminist place, and it's so. It has a lot of those. The values are shared, but there are some of the ideas are how you deploy those values. There's disagreements about those kinds of things.
Okay.
But it has a kind of comforting thing that you can be around people who who share your values and are kind of sharing your emotional reaction to the world.
I was thinking that causes might do that. If you're passionate about the environment and can be part of a group, an ecologically minded group.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And so we do. And so people, because we're social by nature, right? We find all kinds of ways to be social.
So clubs do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you like bicycling and you're in a big bicycling club, somebody dies, the whole club goes
show up
to mourn them,
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, the one thing the religion offers is in that vein is it knows how to perpetuate itself over time. So 30 years from now, you can count on it's still going to be there. Other clubs may be good at that or may not be, but if they're good at it, then you're definitely going to find a lot of those same patterns for sure. Because that's just human. That's just the human thing to do.
Doesn't religion also kind of try to connect itself to these sort of otherworldly religious experiences that we have?
That's the Eliades bit, is to talk especially about religious experience. Now, what for me, that religious experience is not an important metaphysical thing. It's an epistemological thing. It's a knowledge question, not a reality question. So it's okay. People have these experiences. That's interesting. What are they making of them? What is the importance there, and what do they want to do with it? But I don't think for me, the importance is not the value. The value is not in the cause.
But these experiences are really different, out of otherworldly and almost impossible to describe. So when people start to describe those things, they say things like, well, it wasn't really in time or in space. It was this other, so that they're kind of unique. And religion is the body of stuff that tends to connect itself to that. Whereas these other social systems and knowledge systems don't go there. They don't say, well, they're rational in a sense and explainable. Well, religion claims that, and then
Yeah, and it's
from there to various doctrines.
Right, because people want to connect those experiences to this worldview, and so where a social club, like the bicycle club, it's not, those are kind of beyond what it cares about. So individuals may talk with each other, but it's not what they're there for. So it's not definitive. Where in a religious community, that becomes a kind of defining kind of a thing because it gets wrapped up into the worldview. Yeah. Yeah. So on the handout I had for that week, that was that week 4. So I had some definitions that I've come up with over time. And so the first one is the bit that I've just been going over with from my dissertation. Religion is a social institution that is organized geographically or culturally, at least partially, to provide for certain basic needs, for an understanding of the world, the place of society in that world, and the role of the individual, as well as facilitating ongoing social cohesion. So that's sort of the scholarly wrap up of what I've come up with in trying to figure out religion. And then people bothering me. So tied to that, then I sort of more recently came up with sort of a way that I define what I think people mean by the word God, which was the last thing on that sheet. So God is not the source or cause of a feeling. That the spirituality is what I'm getting at. Spiritual feelings. God is the name of the feeling. God is not the other end of the line. God is the feeling of having that line, that connection to reality. So again, sort of moving out of metaphysics into epistemology. So it's not about ultimate reality. Now it's about knowing. So God then just becomes the name of a feeling or a way of knowing. And then kind of the most recent published contribution I have is this definition of spirituality, which I came up with a few years ago. I was asked to contribute to a collection of stuff on Erich Fromm, and was looking at how he talks about love, and anyway had this way of thinking about it that came to me. Spirituality is the practice of, or the experience of, reconnecting with something outside of and larger than the self, something that is social, natural, and or supernatural. So that's there as a general. I wanted it to be a generic definition for spirituality that would fit theistic as well as non-theistic uses. So for defining purposes, I allow the word supernatural in there. Love is interpersonal. Spirituality is transpersonal. Reconnection is accomplished through experiences of felt intimacy between the self and other, a something other that is worthy, vital as judged by the individual or the tradition. So, the point is there, you can have like a nature spirituality that some people talk about. Well, nature is bigger than you. So the experience can properly, in this definition, could be called a spiritual experience or religious experience because it's a feeling of connection or reconnection, could be, with something larger. And so that whatever that larger could be, various things. Like for me, my own sort of deeply felt connection there emotionally is to history. So like the idea of being up on, we call it the bima in Hebrew, up on the front of the sanctuary, and like just touching a Torah scroll, and in our synagogue, the Torah scroll is leftover from World War II, oddly enough. So it was made around 1944. So the scroll itself has some history, but the words on the scroll, go back 3,000 years, and some of them, the original words before they were written down, are going back 4,000 or 5,000 years in terms of oral traditions. So it's, for me, that's a really powerful kind of experience of touching history in a very literal sense, by the touching of the scroll. So, but that history then for me, that's a bigger than me. So it's something bigger than the self. So anyway, so part of that argument is that since I've argued that we're all religious, I have to have some argument about what that religious experience is for all of us. And so this then becomes my accounting of that. What is religious experience? Even if you're not religious, you still have these experiences sometimes. This is what they are. That seems presumptuous, doesn't it, for a philosopher to describe? That's what we do. It's just our job.
And this philosophical discussion is a transcending for me. I hate to go back to this real world of
the banal world of ordinary life. People doing bad things. Yeah.
Might the connection with nature be a source of hope for changing our relationship with the planet and doing something about climate change? I mean, if the environmental movement reached the level of religion and that kind of stuff, might be a positive?
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think that's possible. I mean, the interesting, I sent you all the paper that I wrote, which is pretty pessimistic, but
right. Yeah.
You can point right now, like, the elections in Australia a few days ago, where they just swept out the Conservative Party with this overwhelming majority and put in a slate of people who are just said, time to take climate change seriously. So, it's like, that was a surprise, it blew everyone away. Nobody was expecting that was going to turn out that big. There were some people who thought their little win maybe for the liberal side, but there's still a lot of people thinking the Conservatives were going to win. So, but then when they get trounced that way, it's like, that's all right. See, look, people are waking up. Yeah. So, I mean, it's as a Marxist, that's sort of the language I use is dialectics, that every action, there's a reaction. And so one thing that makes history going forward, the future unpredictable is that actions will have reactions, and the reactions are sometimes very difficult to anticipate. Like that election.
Or Roe versus Wade.
Mm-hmm. Well, see, and what will happen? What will the reaction be?
Exactly.
And we don't, and it could just sort of blow everything up, and it'll force big changes. And so with that one, there's a lot of people who noticed that, because none of the Republicans were gleeful at the release of the draft, because they all understood this possibility. The voters may react. So yeah, you don't. In the end, we don't know. It's open. All righty. That was a hopeful note. That was good to end on.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Richard, for taking.
You're quite welcome. Thank you all very much for coming.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can't be a teacher without students.
And then you're gonna do something in the fall.
Oh, I wanted to ask you guys if you had any ideas or desires or suggestions.
Whatever you do.
That's sweet. I appreciate that. I'll try to think of some. I don't have any ideas going right now, so we'll see what I can come up with. But certainly, you can always email me if you have something occurs to you. It's like, oh, hey, this might be interesting. Just shoot me an email and let me know.
You're always interesting, Richard.
Thank you. I often tell people my education is primarily cocktail conversation, right? Because I've learned all this stuff about things that people normally don't talk to, but I know all this trivia.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, you all take care. You have a good summer.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks.
See some of you in the fall.
Hey, everybody.
All right.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Bye.
All right. Oh, stop the recording.